Welcome to today's broadcast of North Idaho College Public Forum. The crew is comprised of NIC television students, and your moderator is North Idaho College political scientist Tony Stewart.
Welcome to part 2 of our series entitled South Africa. Today's program we wish to discuss the United States economic sanctions as a response to South African apartheid. And I'm so happy to welcome to our program Mr. Ibrahim Gassama, who is a senior research fellow for Trans-Africa, a black lobbyist group in Washington, D.C. That organization comprises 15,000 members and was established in 1977. It is best known and is renowned for its work in attempting to get this country to apply economic sanctions against South Africa, and it has been very successful. The director of that organization was arrested in the embassy some years ago, and now I'm sure you're aware that a number of national, well-known people in this country have been arrested protesting before the South African embassy. Our guest is going to answer our questions and address that very important aspect of the topic that we're dealing with, South Africa. Our guest is licensed to practice law in New York and is a graduate of Harvard Law School. Mr. Gassama, it's a pleasure to have you on our program, and I know that it's been a very much a hardship to even ask you to come. You've got a very busy schedule, and we're grateful you can be with us on our campus.
Thank you very much.
And I welcome to the panel to question our guest. To my immediate left is Lee Ray, who's a community activist and has been a candidate for the Idaho legislature, and regular panelist Janelle Burke, an attorney in Idaho, and I shall invite Janelle Burke to commence the questioning.
Mr. Gassama, perhaps you can tell us, to set the stage for this show, a bit about your background, how you became involved in this issue, where you are employed and by whom, and what that organization stands for. What are its principal goals?
I was born in Freetown, Sierra Leone, which is a small country in West Africa, and I came to the United States in 1974. I attended Virginia Polytechnic Institute and State University, otherwise known as Virginia Tech, and then went on to Harvard Law School. Throughout my student years, I was involved in various issues, and apartheid has always been perhaps the most important issue to me as a person. I think its existence is an insult to every human being in the world, but particularly so to black people. I joined Trans-Africa in 1985, and I have worked, in both the lobby and in the research and educational arm to try and tell Americans a little bit more about what apartheid really is.
What goals does your organization stand for?
Trans-Africa is actually an institution that seeks to better the relations between the United States and Africa. We have become known because of our work concerning South Africa, but we do try to seek to change this country's general policy towards Africa and the Caribbean. Now, in terms of South Africa, our goals are quite simple. We want to end apartheid. We want to bring about a system of democratic government in that country, of one person, one vote, and in the soonest possible time.
What is the position then on economic sanctions?
We believe, we have long argued, that the nations of the world and all those who are opposed to apartheid have tried every other method. It is time now for them to try economic sanctions. We believe that economic sanctions is the only way left to bring about change in South Africa in the most peaceable fashion.
I would like to pursue that, Mr. Gassama. As I indicated in the introduction, your organization has been in the forefront, in fact, the most prominent organization in this country, asking the Congress of the United States to apply economic sanctions. I know the President of the United States was very opposed to this path. He talked about what he labeled as constructive engagement. Would you take a few minutes to explain to us why that particular approach your organization felt was ineffective and why the congressional action was much more appropriate?
Constructive engagement, which has now been thoroughly discredited in most circles, was actually a policy that sought to appease South Africa. When President Reagan came to office, he argued that if only the United States and other Western countries were nice enough to South Africa, the South Africans would gradually change, bring about an end to apartheid. After 5-6 years of this policy, it is clear that it hasn't worked. In fact, apartheid has become more sophisticated, more violent, and the South African rulers have become even more arrogant. It hasn't worked because it has rewarded the apartheid regime, and it has opened this country's technology and capital assets to for the benefit of the South African minority. A constructive engagement hasn't worked, and we've long called for this country to change its policy towards South Africa and to apply, tough, comprehensive economic sanctions. We believe they do work. We believe that the people of South Africa want them, and we believe that the minority regime in Pretoria will listen to economic sanctions.
In relation to that, it's my understanding that there was a lot of negotiation between the President and Congress and different factions within Congress concerning economic sanctions. So those that were passed and were applied, is it not true that they came about through compromise, and are they as effective as you think they should be?
Absolutely. The legislation passed last October was a compromise legislation. The Republicans controlled the Senate, and even though we were able to bring both houses of Congress to understand much more clearly than the President the need for economic sanctions, it was inevitable that the result would be a compromise. It is not exactly what we wanted, but it is a step in the right direction. And this coming legislative year, we are going to be moving for more comprehensive, tougher sanctions against South Africa. The package that is now in place will not by itself do the job. We need more sanctions. And in fact, we are going to be moving beyond the United States. We are going to be calling for comprehensive, worldwide UN Security Council legislation on sanctions.
And one final question before I go into the panel. Could you give our viewers some idea of what is in the package that's presently passed? What are some of the provisions?
The most important features are, one, the ban on new loans and new investment in South Africa. Now, there's a loophole here which allows the reinvestment of profits made in South Africa. Another important feature is the ban in the imports of iron, steel, uranium, and certain agricultural products. There are some loopholes in this area also that we're very concerned about. In the ban against the shipment of oil to South Africa was also strengthened, and a significant but symbolic ban on South African Airways landing in this country and on American Airlines landing in South Africa also went into effect. Those were the more significant provisions of this package.
Lee Ray.
Yes, Mr. Gossema, what would you say the general attitude is of the population of South Africa to the U.S. involvement in this whole issue?
The majority of the people of South Africa, particularly the young people, unfortunately see the United States on the side of the white minority regime. This is not only because of the policies that have been followed by the Reagan administration, but also because of the long history of U.S. involvement in South Africa. We believe this is most unfortunate, and part of Trans-Africa's task is to try and change this, because we are certain that the majority will come to power in South Africa. The question is when. And when they do, we would like for them to have good relations with the United States, and we think there is still time for this country to change its policies so that the majority will see that America stands unequivocally on the side of justice in South Africa.
Janelle Berg.
What generally has been the disagreement in terms of economic sanctions? Who generally has led the opposition to economic sanctions? I would suppose that the whole question of economics goes much further, and it goes into who has a presence in South Africa, what companies are present there, what companies are making money there. And so perhaps you can talk a bit about those areas of economics where American companies might have opposed economic sanctions.
Well, clearly, American companies for long resisted economic sanctions. They were supported by their South African and other foreign counterparts. It is obvious why they opposed economic sanctions. There was a time, now conditions are changing now in South Africa, and many of these companies are now pulling out. But for a long period of time, their rates of return on investment in South Africa was much higher, were much higher than anywhere else in the world. Apartheid, which is essentially a system for economic exploitation, made it lucrative for foreign companies to come into South Africa and build plants. So you had a phenomenon in which American companies were packing up, leaving the United States, and investing in South Africa, because apartheid allows them to pay the lowest possible wages to the black laborers, and also they could always count on the power of the state to crush any kind of labor union activities. So for a long time, the American companies benefited from the situation in South Africa and strongly supported the continued investment of this country's resources in that nation. However, things are changing. The South African people have shown over the past few years that they are absolutely determined to bring about an end to apartheid. They've made apartheid to a large extent unworkable, ungovernable. That, coupled with the public actions in this country, the protests that were engineered by Trans-Africa and groups like that, have put so much pressure on these companies, together with local and state actions. It is no longer profitable for a lot of companies to remain in South Africa. Hence, the pull out of Kodak, which is announced that it's completely pulling out of South Africa, and the partial pullout of IBM, GM, and Coke.
Do you think unrest has something to do with that, the unrest in the country?
Absolutely. That's the main factor, the unrest inside South Africa. These business executives are there. They see, even if the effects of the unrest presently are not that great, they realize that it can only grow. And moreover, many of them have become convinced that the minority regime has no intention of peacefully removing apartheid.
Some groups, particularly in this area, some universities who have among their endowments stocks in companies that were present in South Africa, have sold those holdings. Is that an effective economic sanction?
Absolutely. For years, the whole anti-apartheid movement in this country rested on the actions of students who tried to get their institutions to divest from South Africa. This was important, particularly in those periods when it was not fashionable to be against apartheid. And therefore, divestment over the years has taken on a very symbolic and also a very real policy in terms of trying to bring about change in South Africa. It's important that the movement to get institutions to divest from South Africa continue.
In relation to economic sanctions, our symposium this week has revealed that as far as trade and economic ties to South Africa, that the United States has a small percentage of that compared with European countries, particularly the British. If economic sanctions is to work in a very successful way, is it not necessary that countries such as Great Britain would join the economic sanctions to really create a very strong direct effect upon the South African government?
Well, absolutely. The best effects of economic sanctions will be felt when the nations of the world join together. And that's why, as I indicated earlier, Trans-Africa will be moving for UN sanctions under Chapter 7 of the Security Council, mandatory sanctions against South Africa. And we hope that, unlike the past, the United States, Britain, and France will not veto such actions. It's important that we get these other countries to join, and by far Britain is the most obstinate, recalcitrant country in this matter, because it has the largest chunk of foreign investment inside South Africa. I think the Japanese have been getting a bum rap on this matter. They have never taken the first step, but they closely follow the United States. So we can count on them to duplicate whatever efforts the United States takes in South Africa. Besides, many of the efforts that we are proposing have provisions that would penalize other countries that try to take advantage of the U.S. pullout from South Africa. So it's important that we get other countries to join in this effort, but we should not wait until we get all of the other countries to agree, because they're waiting for the lead of the United States.
May I suggest that there's an analogy with what's happening on this issue in South Africa with what happened in the United States during the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s in the South, as Dr. King and others were applying pressure through economic sanctions and marches and sit-ins. There was a reaction by those who supported segregation to indicate, you must give us more time, and you're putting on too much pressure, you're moving too quickly, or you're moving in a way that violates some laws. We hear the argument now in South Africa that the economic sanctions is the wrong approach, that it must be a more gradual process, and secondly, that the economic sanctions actually hurt the black African more than they do the South African government. Do you agree that there is this somewhat analogy in how you
absolutely,
respond?
Absolutely, with the exception, of course, that the situation in South Africa is infinitely more violent. The authorities there are definitely more deadly, and there is no President Kennedy to send in federal troops there. But we hear all of these arguments, and they are entirely false and fallacious, and anybody who is sincere will recognize them for what they are. The fact of the matter is that some people say sanctions, for example, will hurt blacks. But apartheid has hurt blacks so much that it's inconceivable that anything else can be worse. The fact of the matter is, if you talk in terms of jobs, there are about 70,000 black South Africans who will be affected directly by pullout of American companies from South Africa, for example. But the fact remains that in South Africa today, there are 4 to 6 million unemployed people. Not counting the people on the borders of South Africa. So if people are thinking in terms of creating jobs for blacks and helping black people, there's a lot they can do in the rest of Africa. Obviously, that's not their primary concern. It is an argument that they are using to prevent the eradication of the system that contributes more to the devastation and the degradation of Africa, not just inside South Africa, but all around what we call the frontline states.
Lee Ray.
Yes, would you please explain for our viewers the Sun City issue? There has been some confusion in the past year as to why some musicians have boycotted performing there.
For a long time, the anti-apartheid movement has called on artists and athletes to boycott South Africa because we believe the South Africans value such contacts with the outside world, and it contributes to the legitimization of apartheid. Sun City is a project concocted by the South African government to try and evade this international UN boycott against South Africa in the cultural arena. They created a resort in one of their homelands. As you know, South Africa has designated 10 homelands for black people, and none of which is recognized by the international community. Sun City is a project in one of them, which the South Africans have used to lure international artists into South Africa, essentially to play. And the world community has taken a strong stand on this and has boycotted and has tried to encourage artists not to play in Sun City. There was a project recently by a group of American artists opposed to apartheid called "We're Not Going to Play Sun City," and an album came out of that.
Janelle Burke.
As you mentioned earlier, this is not a simple issue, and it affects all the countries of the world, but it also affects all the countries in Africa. You referred just briefly to the frontline states. Some of those people who oppose apartheid or oppose the economic sanctions to end apartheid have indicated that it would be difficult for those frontline states, which in the past have become tied economically to South Africa, to continue to export their materials. Perhaps you can enlighten our viewers as to what your feeling is about economic sanctions and how they would affect the frontline states.
We are very concerned at Trans-Africa about the impact of economic sanctions on the frontline states. We're talking about countries like Zimbabwe, Zambia, Mozambique, Angola, Lesotho, Botswana that surround South Africa. And the South Africans have indicated that if the world imposes economic sanctions on them, they are going to take it out on these countries. South Africa, over the years, with the encouragement of Western powers, have built a network such that these countries are, in a sense, very much dependent on South Africa. But the fact remains that each one of those countries, through their official representatives, has supported economic sanctions against South Africa. Trans-Africa is in constant communication with the ambassadors of those countries. We're in touch with their governments. Each one of them, from Mozambique to Angola, supports economic sanctions because they realize that It might hurt them a lot in the short term, but over the long term, it's in their interest to wean themselves away from South Africa. Presently, there's a move afoot in the United States to get this country to contribute more to an organization called SADC in Southern Africa, called the Southern Africa Development Coordinating Conference. This is an organization of these frontline states that are seeking to wean themselves away from apartheid South Africa. They're trying to develop their own infrastructure. It has not been easy, and this country has curiously not contributed even a fraction of what, say, the Scandinavian countries have contributed to this project to build alternative rail and port facilities, roads, etc. I should also mention that as part of the South African strategy of trying to tie these countries to it so that the rest of the world will be afraid of imposing sanctions, South Africa has supported dissident groups, bandit groups in various countries. In Mozambique, you have a group called Renamo, or the MNR, that just goes about destroying roads and bridges and all kinds of economic infrastructure and killing people, terrorizing people. Unfortunately, this group receives a lot of support from right-wing sources in this country. There's another group in Angola called UNITA, which unfortunately President Reagan has officially supported. These are groups that are supported by South Africa. Most of their personnel are trained by South Africa. Their actions are coordinated by South Africa, and their sole purpose is to deny these African countries around South Africa their right to be independent. But even with all these difficulties, I should stress again that these countries are determined that we proceed with economic sanctions. They would like assistance to help alleviate the bad effects of economic sanctions. But these countries do support economic sanctions, and so do the people of South Africa themselves. When they are asked, as one man said in the New York Times interview recently, "I wish I had suffered 15 years ago so that my child would not suffer now." And I think that's the attitude of most South Africans. It would be rough, it would be difficult for some of them, but at least it ensures, hopefully, a brighter future for their offsprings.
Mr. Kasama, we have briefly mentioned the fact that your organization, Trans-Africa, and others would like some more sanctions applied and other policies, but we've not really delved into the specifics. I'd like to give you this opportunity to tell our audience about some other things you'd like to see this country do in the year that lies ahead.
The legs on which apartheid stand are created in the Western nations. We talk of oil, for example. South Africa doesn't produce its own oil. South Africa depends on the outside world to supply it with energy, the energy that it uses in its daily machinery, and particularly in its armed forces, to continue this violence against the people of South Africa. We want the UN embargo on oil enforced. We would like to see that enforced. South Africa produces a lot of weapons, but 80% of the components of those weapons come from the outside world, from the Western world. It's important that the UN mandatory embargo, which this nation also supported in 1977, be enforced. We would like to see South Africa denied basically sophisticated technology without which it cannot run the apartheid system. Technology and capital. South Africa needs outside capital. 17% of the investments in South Africa come from the outside world. We must deny that to South Africa. We must deny sophisticated technology, computers, electronic equipment, automobiles that are used by the military, produced by GM and Ford Technology. We must deny South Africa those things. And it must be comprehensive, it must be enforced sincerely, and it must be done in the as soon as possible time. You see, economic sanctions, we believe strongly, and legitimate South African leaders like Winnie Mandela, Bishop Tutu, and others have said it. It's the surest way of bringing about change in South Africa in the most peaceable manner. You notice I don't say in a non-violent manner, because I believe the struggle has gone beyond that. But we must now try to minimize the violence. And economic sanctions are all we have left.
I would like to ask one more question that has a little bit of difference to the economic sanctions, but there are some reports that the very extreme right within the National Party in South Africa is growing, really the Nazi wing of the party. Is this the correct case, and what chance do they have of taking control of the party and the government?
Oh, absolutely. As the struggle against apartheid intensifies, there are schisms within each of the groups. And in South Africa, President Botha has his hands full trying to deal with the right wing of his party, which is growing every day. Now, it is easy to become sympathetic towards Mr. Botha on this matter, but what one has to understand that even the policies he practiced are so extreme for the black South Africans that we cannot really spend our time worrying about how he deals with his internal problems. The fact of the matter is they are both bad for the majority of black South Africans, and they would like to see both of them go. We don't believe, however, that the right wing will ever become such a threat to the Nationalist Party. We think for the foreseeable future, the main concern will be the Nationalist Afrikaner Party that is now in power in South Africa, headed by President Botha.
Lee Ray.
Yes, are plans being made now for the transition of power once apartheid has ended? And second question, do you see a power struggle between black leaders once apartheid has ended?
One of the things we've tried to do at Trans-Africa is not to get too involved into how the South Africans will organize their lives once apartheid has ended. We are afraid that with too much international focus on that, we'll be making the same error of trying to tell people how to run their country. One thing we are certain of at Trans-Africa is that we are opposed to apartheid, and we are opposed to this nation's support of apartheid. We cannot go further, but we can guarantee, of course, that whatever government comes to South Africa, if we don't like it, we will oppose it. That's the best we can do. We cannot go further into trying to tell South Africans how to run things once they've removed apartheid. I don't know whether they have made plans. I hope they've made plans to run things so that, you know, the machinery, it's a much developed country. We don't want it to break down. Right. So we hope they've made plans to run the country in a democratic fashion once apartheid is ended. We are, however, not involved in that aspect of it.
With that, I have to bring our program to conclusion. On behalf of our panel and our staff, we thank you very much. It's been enlightening and adds great quality to this program and to our institution. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, our guest has been Mr. Ibrahim Gassama, who is a senior research fellow with Trans-Africa and is an attorney, graduate of Harvard. I hope you've enjoyed our program, and I want to invite you to be with us again next week, and we'll continue this series of programs that we are bringing to you at the same time that we have been having a symposium at North Idaho College on South Africa, the politics of apartheid. We want to, again, as I've emphasized, continue next week, and we hope you'll be with us that time. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
North Idaho College Public Forum can be seen at the same time each week over this station. This production was videotaped earlier by an NIC student crew for viewing at this more appropriate time.